All right. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from today. Thank you again for joining us for the first part in a communications workshop series. Happy to welcome today our three facilitators, Jack, Matthias, and Megan. And yeah, I figure we will dive right into it, and I will hand over the podium to you, Jack.
Thank you so much, Pierre, and welcome everyone. I'm Jack. I'm your friendly neighborhood comms manager here at ChildBright, and I'm so thrilled to be here today with my two lovely co-facilitators to be asking a very important question when it comes to patient-oriented communications, which is, what's the story? And in the spirit of accessibility, which is the topic of our first session today, I should probably explain that when I say patient-oriented, I'm referring to patient-oriented research. So ChildBright Network, where I work, is a patient-oriented research network. And that means that everything we do, all the research we do to help improve the quality of life and health outcomes for children with brain-based developmental disabilities and their families is done informed by and done in collaboration with people with lived and living experience of disability. And so you can probably imagine with, a pan-Canadian network, we have nearly 500 members. It's interdisciplinary. We have people with lived experience, community partners. As part of our network, we want to disseminate information as widely as possible. Writing and communicating accessibly is really important to do all that. And so we're here to share with you today some of the best practices for doing that. And for us, that really boils down to understanding what your story is. So what we'll be doing today, I can run that down very quickly. On the menu, we're going to be starting with, well, what is accessible writing? What do we mean by that? Why is it important? How to identify and write for your audience. Why does storytelling matter for accessibility? We're going to provide some tips for making your writing easier to read, and we're going to end with some basic accessibility considerations around use of images, how to write alt text, all that fun stuff. But before we dive into that, I do want to acknowledge that the ChildBright Network head office is located on unceded Indigenous territory called Chochage in the Kanien'kehá:ka language, called Muniyang in Anishinaabemowin, or Montreal. And again, in the spirit of accessibility, I want to explain that when I say unceded territory, I'm referring to land that has belonged to Indigenous people that was never surrendered or acquired by the Crown. I am a white queer settler. I was born and raised in what is sometimes called Montreal. I have ADHD. I am a writer and an editor. I work in two colonial languages, English and French. And I specify this because language is power. And I want to call attention to, the historical attempts on the part of settlers and settler governments to sever the connections between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and their cultures and their languages. And so up on the screen right now, I have calls from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that relate to language. There are four, and I'll just skip to the next slide here to show you the fourth one. And I encourage everyone here today, either after the call or in the coming days and weeks, to read through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls related to language and to reflect a little bit on the updates that have been made and the progress that has been made, the progress that is still to be made when it comes to promoting Indigenous language here on Turtle Island. Now, here is me and my two lovely facilitators here today, and I want to introduce them to you right now. Matthias Castaldo holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Toronto Metropolitan University. Matthias also holds a Master's of Education in Developmental Psychology and Human Development from OISE. Matthias is a previous member of our National Youth Advisory Panel, now the National Youth Advocacy Panel. And actually, Matthias is not only a previous member, but was the inaugural chair of this youth council, and so has been very involved for many years with ChildBright. Matthias previously worked as a patient partner on the CU project with Dr. Sakiko Yamaguchi. Matthias is currently involved with the Youth Engagement and Research Project with Dr. Linda Nguyen, the Youth Employment Project with Dr. Keiko Shikako, and Matthias currently works as a youth facilitator and family support specialist at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. So thank you for joining us, Matthias. I think you'll have such wonderful perspective to share on this topic today. And also joining me is Megan Callahan, who is a writer and French to English translator born and raised in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. She holds a BA with honors in linguistics and an MA in translation studies from Concordia University. By day, she is my colleague as the writer and editor for the Child Bright Network, and by night, she's hard at work on her debut short story collection. Megan's fiction has appeared in various Canadian and American publications, including 2021 Best Canadian Stories. She lives in Point St. Charles with her husband and daughter. Thank you, Megan, for joining us. So, what is accessible writing, and why is it important? I have two definitions up on the screen here right now, and I think they speak quite nicely to one another. The first one comes from a University of Bristol inclusive writing guide, and it reads, accessible writing means making sure all users can read and understand what you write, including users with different mental and physical abilities. It includes the language you use, the structure of the text, and the way you organize and present content. The second definition comes from the AODA website, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and it adds, I think, nicely to this first definition. If writers use an accessible style, the writer can ensure that the text reaches as wide an audience as possible. My perspective on this is that accessible writing means ensuring A, your text reaches your intended audience or public, and B, that your intended public can understand it. Put differently, there is no point to writing if it's not accessible for your intended audience. And I make this distinction about intended public and audience because your writing will look very different depending on your audience, depending on the format and the destination. So when we go through things today like eliminating use of jargon, rewriting to make things easier to read, these are just different tools that you can keep in your toolkit, and you can take them out depending on the context, depending on what makes the most sense for your writing. Now I'm going to turn it over to a second to Matthias so that he can answer this very easy question to answer, which is, why is all this important?
Thanks, Jacqueline. So in my opinion, and based on from my perspective, the more people are able to understand the writing and the information, the greater impact that information is going to have on, say, its target audience and on society in general. In addition, like the more that information and writing is accessible, the larger amount of people will have access to that information. As you mentioned before, knowledge is power. So the more we're able to understand the content and the information, the better equipped we are to use that information to make an informed decision. And that could be like an informed decision, whether that's in policy or a healthcare decision. And also it should be noted that understanding the content or the information is very empowering. And this could potentially inspire people to get involved in things like research or conduct their own research, and even potentially pursue a career in academia. And it's in part because they realize that not only understanding and reading is fun and interesting, it's also that they realize that something like research can be accessible. The more that we're able to like essentially understand information and that the information in writing is accessible, the more likely, in my opinion, people are going to seek out and read something like a peer-reviewed article over a tabloid article where the information might not be as accurate or might be inaccurate.
Thank you for that, Matthias. And for a patient-oriented research network like Child Bright, in order to be able to disseminate findings in a way that is impactful and meaningful, of course, this is really key. So I just spoke about how to identify and how to write for your audience. Step one is understanding who your public is. And so here are a couple of ways that we do that. First step is asking, where is this being published, right? This might seem like a little bit of a no-brainer, but it's, you have to be able to understand how am I going to adapt my tone, my style of writing for that outlet or for that platform. If I'm writing a blog post, if I'm writing a plain language summary for a scientific journal, if I'm writing a social media post, a recruitment poster, a script for a podcast, then that will all inform what kind of language I'm using, what the format is going to be. So that is step number one. Step number two is familiarizing yourself with the tone of that outlet or that platform. And then three, and this is what we're really going to sink our teeth into as the meat of this session is, what is your intended outcome? What is your reason for writing? Is it education? Is it awareness? Do you have a specific call to action? And when it comes to research, oftentimes a call to action can be recruiting participants, recruiting research partners. Are you trying to engage the community in some way? And so before you ever set digital pen to digital paper, it's important to have a clear idea in your mind of, what is the why? What is the story behind this? And I will pull up the ChildBright blog for just a moment here to share an example of how we do this at ChildBright. So this was a blog post that we published in May 2024 that announced a language refresh that we did. We were changing some of the terminology that we are using around patient-oriented research and the work that we do. And so the first question that we want to ask, where is this being published? Well, ChildBright blog, maybe that's an easy one for this example. And so I have in mind, okay, who are the people who tend to usually read this blog? There are members, obviously. They're members of the child health research community. They may have some background in child health research and patient-oriented research, but they may not be experts and they might have varying levels of understanding of the work that we do. And so we know that, Megan and I, as we're putting together this post, that we want to make sure that we're really breaking down not only what it is that, what the changes are, but what the process behind the changes were and why they're important. And so you'll see that we broke that down right at the very beginning of this blog post, right? And so we explain how we arrive at the changes to our language, why we wanted to do them, and why language matters. So right away, we are trying to get to the emotional component or the story behind this change. And we start with, the newsiest part, which is the updates. And you'll see that Megan had prepared this beautiful graphic that really just clearly laid out, okay, we have changes to language. We used to use the word patient partner a lot to refer to people we now call partners with lived and living experience. And so we talk about accessible writing. It can also mean presenting your information in different ways, in this case, in a very short table or graphic. From there, and you can also see that we had a plain text version of this table that is available. And we'll get back into this in a moment when it comes to basic accessibility considerations, but using different formats can also be an accessibility consideration. From there, we had another header, which was, why is ChildBright changing the vocabulary it uses to refer to its research partners? And here we got into, the way we engaged our partners to understand how language is evolving around disability research, and the way that our partners perceive ourselves. And so we wanted to be transparent and bring to light the kind of discussions that we have internally and externally with our community partners. And then finally, we ended with this question of why does language matter? And you'll see that in these headers and subheaders on the blog post, we're often phrasing them as questions. Why does language matter? We want to be able to pull a reader in with this question that hopefully, implies the importance of the work that we're doing, and then answer it in the body text. So if you're wondering, okay, this is all well and good, but how do I actually do all of this? Then you are in luck, because I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Megan, right now to get into the nuts and bolts of, why does storytelling matter for accessible writing? Megan?
Thank you so much, Jack. Just to let everyone know, I'm recovering from the flu, so I may cough. I apologize during the presentation. So first of all, I wanted to just kind of break down the 3 reasons why I think storytelling not only matters, but really works to convey information. So, we've seen in research that stories are a key part of how human beings interact and learn. And you see it even in infancy. From the moment we're born, storytelling supports language development, imagination, bonding, social and emotional growth. So it's really something that we do as humans from birth. Is storytelling is helping us learn. They're also just entertaining, which means that they're engaging us on an emotional level, which means we're paying attention, we're focused. In the classroom, research has shown that teachers can make learning more engaging and memorable if they use narrative structures. So again, this is just like one of those like basic human things that we have. We respond to stories. And then finally, if we're talking about research specifically, storytelling can really bring your findings to life. And by connecting, by resonating, it can allow you to connect with a range of audiences. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this was a quote that I found by this researcher, Dr. Helen Kara, which I think really sums up the importance of storytelling in research. So we should have one clear story to tell of why we are doing our research, and another to explain what the research is about. When we come to report on our research, whatever the medium, written, presented, remotely, presented in person, video, animation, multimedia, whatever, our message should be wrapped in stories. Stories are engaging, informative, and memorable. Surely that's exactly what we want our research to be. So I just highlighted the key terms that I think are, the most important. You want to be telling the why and the what, of course. And but then you also want to have that emotional component. It needs to be engaging and it needs to be memorable. Next slide, thank you. So just as a quick example, I am a big fan of science. I love reading about science, but I'm not a scientist. And so I really appreciate magazines like Popular Science, which will use storytelling very effectively to share and disseminate scientific information. And so I found these 2 articles that were originally published in Nature, and Popular Science then showcased these, and so obviously had to kind of adapt the language for their audience. And I just thought this was such a great example of thinking about your audience and thinking about the tone and thinking about where is, certain language more appropriate. And so these are just the titles of the articles. So in Nature magazine, the first title is Membrane Potential States, Gate Synaptic Consolidation in Human Neocortical Tissue. So to me, that is completely inaccessible to someone who's not an expert in the field. And the Popular Science title was, Why is Deep Sleep So Important to Memory? It's About Time. Slow brain waves are key to an important neurological process. And I thought it was so interesting what Jack said earlier about asking a question. And I think that that's also something you see often in these kind of more popular science articles, is they're asking a question to draw you in, but they're also being very informative. They are addressing the what and the why, and they're making the story relatable. Everyone cares about sleep. everyone cares about memory. These are human experiences. And so they're really breaking it down in a way that makes you care about what this story is. And so the second example does the exact same thing. Self-experience of a negative event alters responses to others in similar states through prefrontal cortex CRF mechanisms. So I understood none of that. But then in the Popular Science article, it becomes past experiences strongly affect empathy in mice. The ability to recognize and react to others' emotions is not confined to humans. And so suddenly the topic is fascinating. I want to learn more about it. So I think these are just two really, really great examples of, again, your audience. One is not better than the other. It's really about who's reading it and who are you targeting.
Thank you for that, Megan. And so for our audience today, once they have an idea of, okay, I know what my story is, I know what's important about the story I want to tell, and they're at the point of wanting to sit down and write it in a way that is accessible to their public, can you share some tips on how to do that?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to be drawing on my linguistic background for this part. So I'm going to be focusing on these four really easy ways to make your writing more accessible and just easier to read for a general public. So the first one is, I would say, the most intuitive. Most of you have probably thought of this already. Avoid scientific jargon or acronyms that you have not explained. Either avoid the jargon and the acronyms or explain them in a parentheses. Another one that is maybe less intuitive is to use Germanic words instead of Latinate words. And by that, I mean English words that are derived from Proto-Germanic versus ones that are derived from Latin. And I'm going to explain that a bit more later. Third, to use simple verbs instead of verb phrases. This is really about being as concise as possible. And finally, this is especially relevant for the Child Bright Network, but I think is applicable to most fields, to use non-ableist language. So these are just a couple of quick examples of jargon that has been, again, simplified or rephrased for non-expert audience. So again, these were examples I took from, the first one is from Nature magazine, and then the same information disseminated in Popular Science. So during slow wave sleep, neurons exhibit characteristic membrane potential oscillations known as up and down states. Coupling of memory reactivation to these slow oscillations promotes consolidation. So very, very difficult to understand if you are not an expert in this field. Popular Science says slow brain waves make the neocortex, where long-term memory is stored in the brain, particularly receptive to new information. So I love that they explain neocortex. I thought that was great. And they're sharing the information. There's no information that's been lost. It's really just been summarized and simplified. And then the second example is actually from our website. It was something that when I came onto the team, I was being faced with the specific terminology and jargon of the Child Bright Network, which I was not familiar with when I first came on board. And I think that actually was helpful, because I think when you're in a field for so long, you almost forget what is jargon and what isn't, because you're siloed in it. And so for me, there was a lot of acronyms that I had never heard of before, and a lot of terms that I felt were quite vague or really being used in a specific context. So this is one example. How can pan-Canadian research networks like Child Bright build IS capacity among PDFs? So when I read this initially, I was like, well, what's IS? What's a PDF? And what do we mean by capacity? Like, that's quite vague to me. And so after speaking with a few people on the team, I rewrote it as, how can pan-Canadian research networks like Child Bright develop implementation science skills among postdoctoral research fellows? So I think this is just an example of some terms and phrases that you might assume that everyone understands and knows, but that is actually very specific to your field. Oh yes, Germanic instead of Latinate words. So this is quite interesting. From a historical linguistics perspective, I'm just gonna do a little segue, is there has been historically a class division between Germanic languages, so languages that are derived from Proto-Germanic, and those of Latin origin. And so the English language derives mainly from Old English, which is Germanic, and Old French, which is derived from Latin. And so after the Normans conquered England in 1066, the country was dominated by the French aristocracy ruling over the English-speaking working class. So Old French was the language of the aristocracy for more than 3 centuries in Europe, and the common person spoke Old English. And so there is this history of, you know, Old French, these like Latinate languages, Romance languages being the language of the upper crust and the aristocracy, whereas Germanic languages like Old English being really like a working class language. And you still feel that today. As you can see, the Germanic words tend to be shorter, more direct, more concrete, whereas the words derived from Old French are more elaborate, more abstract, and indirect. And so this is actually a really easy way to kind of edit your text and try to make it a little bit more approachable and a little bit simpler. And if you don't know intuitively what words are Germanic versus which are Latinate, that's fine. There's tons of resources online that will actually give you lists of equivalents, English Latinate versus English Germanic. And we are going to be providing some resources on that after the workshop. So this third tip, use simple verbs instead of verb phrases. This really comes down to being concise. So omitting any words that are unnecessary, that just make your sentences longer and it might cause confusion. So verb phrases are here, just a bunch of examples of verb phrases. Submit your application, take into consideration, make a modification. You see these a lot in, well, you see them everywhere really, but I think you see them a lot in research articles. And I think that in so many cases, these can just be truncated, simplified to the basic verb form, and it will just automatically make your writing simpler and clearer. And finally, tip 4, use non-ableist language. So this is the definition of ableism in the 2025 CAN language guide. Ableism is a belief that persons with disabilities are less worthy of respect and consideration, less able to contribute to and participate in society, or of less inherent value than people without disabilities. Excuse me. So there, when you're thinking about using non-ableist language, the idea is to emphasize these 3 points here. The need for accommodations for people with disabilities rather than the presence of a disability. To highlight that individuals with disabilities are people first with diverse and multifaceted identities. And of course, to avoid language that equates disability with illness. So we're just going to look at a few examples of that. I think, again, if you are not in a research field or a disability field, these may not be intuitive, which is why I think it's important to think about them consciously. So some examples of ableist language: person confined to a wheelchair, wheelchair bound. So an alternative that kind of refocuses and reframes this is a person who uses a wheelchair or a wheelchair user. So you lose the negative connotation. Similarly, you might see someone suffering from bipolar disorder, whereas non-ableist would be living with that bipolar disorder. He is disabled versus he has a disability. Normal, healthy individuals versus non-disabled individuals. And finally, handicapped parking versus parking for people with disabilities, accessible parking. I don't know if Matthias, if you wanted to speak to any of these examples.
Yeah, no, I think kind of just like you really covered it. I think kind of like overall, in society, I think it's important to use these types of words because I think it just creates like a general an understanding of the term. It also helps us just be mindful of our audience, right? Everyone's experience with, say, for example, disability is different. So the more we're able to use, a person with a disability, the alternatives, the accessible words, I think the more accepting it is, and the more understanding, the greater respect we have for the population that, say, our content is being, our target audience is. So I think kind of that's really kind of why, in my opinion, I agree with you, Megan, why these types of alternatives are super important. It just kind of expands our knowledge. It creates greater understanding. It also helps, I think, society understand as well, right? Because often the traditional ableist language is so ingrained in our society. And I know growing up, like I've heard these types of words all the time and it was just thrown around casually. But I think when we're more intentional, it creates greater understanding, greater knowledge, and just overall expands our vocabulary and respect for our for everyone in our society as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. I think that intentionality is really important.
Yeah, I agree. And if I can jump in, I will add that, Matthias, you said everyone's experience of disability is different. And I think that's important to recognize. And oftentimes, let's say from our communications perspective, we've developed a certain language guide around the terminology that is preferred and versus the, moving away from ableist language. But like I was just saying earlier, terminology evolves, right? And so there can be an evolution within specific communities or even specific individuals choose to refer to themselves differently. And so the collaborative nature of communication and of meaning making through language is really key here. And this is why I put a little starred note next to he is disabled versus he has a disability, because I think that's an example of expression that, may vary according to people's preference, right? And so my standard might be saying, putting the person using person first language. But maybe some people prefer identity first language. And so being mindful and respectful of that, I think, is part of patient-oriented communication. Megan, was there anything else you wanted to mention here before we move on?
No, we can move on. Thank you.
Awesome. So now we're at the interactive portion of this workshop. And I hope you all read It's Jargon Busting Time in like a Superman, Power Rangers type voice, because that's how excited we are about this exercise. And so given everything that, Megan just covered and that we've been talking about so far, I would love to hear from participants, either, by raising your hand and unmuting or dropping in the chat, jargon that you hear a lot. Maybe that's something from your field. Maybe that's there are words and expressions that are not from your field and that you don't have an understanding of. So I'd be curious to hear from all of you now. What are some examples of jargon that you think we would need to either eliminate or rephrase when they come up? And while we're waiting just for people to warm up their thinking caps on, I'm going to write one in right now that comes up all the time at Child Bright, which is pediatric population. And that's, maybe low-hanging fruit. Oftentimes when we see that, we rephrase from pediatric population to, children and youth, which is often what we're talking about, Child Bright. That is the population we work with. Okay, I see 2 hands raised. Michelle, do you have an example of jargon that you would like to see rephrased?
Yeah, for me, especially when researchers are talking about methodology, which is also a weird word, they when they're talking about a Delphi process, that's very intimidating to lived experience partners. And I wonder if there's a way, even the word consensus is not great. So maybe it's sort of shared agreement or something. When they talk about Delphi, they could say this is a way of coming to a shared agreement.
That's a great alternative, Michelle. Thank you. And I see Rhaenyra.
Hi. Yeah, I probably have like so many examples of jargony scientific terms, but one thing that I think we also don't think about are terms like youth engagement, right? What does that mean? So I work with a lot of young people with lived experience, and we develop tools and things. They might write on that tool like this was developed by the youth engagement team, but what does that mean, right? Because not everyone in the scientific community is up to speed on what it means to engage with people with lived experience. So that's just one example, but I just think it's so important to always, always, always think about the audience and what do they know. They may not know as much as you would hope they know, for sure.
I love that example because I think youth engagement, certainly for me, is a shorthand that I tend to use for a whole number of ways that youth can be involved in research. So I'm curious, if you want to share, is there a way, Rhaenyra, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is there one way that you would, in your own work, tend to rephrase that or explain that? What's the process you usually use when you come up with this?
Yes, you said my name perfectly. Thank you. And yeah, I usually I leave it up to the youth, right? But what I'll tell them is, well, if I called you up on the phone and asked you to explain to me what you're doing, what would you tell me, right? Because the way we talk on the phone or with our friends is completely different than the way we talk on stage, but people connect to the way you talk to your friend, right? So they'll say things like, oh, well, I work with researchers and together we collaborate on projects. I provide input, things like that. And oftentimes these terms require explanation because if you have a scientist who's not used to the whole concept of what it means to engage, they need it explained to them. So it's also an opportunity to sort of spread the word of how important this engagement work really is.
I love that. And I love two components of your answer. One of them asking your youth partners or the partners that you're working with. This is something that we also recommend when it comes to accessible writing is, doing it collaboratively at the least, let's say having some form of peer review or peer editing. But just actually talking to someone else, the way you speak is often very different from the way you tend to write something down, which can be more formalized. And so if you're looking to move towards something that is a little bit more casual or a little bit easier to understand, just having that conversation and taking that note down is a really, really great approach. Are there any other examples that people want to provide? I'm going to add one more just because I had it on my list and I wanted to share it. Longitudinally. So we'll often say, let's follow children longitudinally. I can barely pronounce it. And that language may be appropriate in some instances, but if you want to rephrase it, you could say something like, let's follow children over time to see the effects of X treatment. Gail, go ahead.
Hey, Jack. So one thing that comes up a lot in my line of work is the word translation in the context of knowledge translation and translational research. Because if we share that with, I would say, lay public, they wouldn't really understand what that means. So one thing that I did in the past is to be very specific in terms of what that translational project is. Is it an app? Is it a program or something that would be really understandable in the general public?
Yeah, I think that's another great example of a tool you can use, right? So you can define your term, but you can explain, okay, what are examples of this? And I was actually going to write in, brain-based developmental disability, which is a term that Child Bright uses obviously all the time. And, one option can be to explain, okay, what is the definition of brain-based developmental disability? Another option is to provide some examples of these types of disabilities. And so maybe someone is less familiar with that term, but is more familiar with terms like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. And so I think that's another great option. I see another hand raised. Saida, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, thank you so much. So the same term like knowledge mobilization.
Mm.
like the knowledge translation and the knowledge mobilization. So it looks like, yeah, so how to explain this term?
Yeah, I think that's another great one that we use all the time. And one way that I've been translating this has been to say that we are putting research into action, right? And maybe that's a little bit catchphrasey and comms marketing speak. But you know, another example of a way to explain this would be to give those examples of what knowledge mobilization actually means, right? Putting evidence, research evidence into practice. Rhaenyra, I'll take one more comment and then we'll move on. But please, I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so I actually I'm the knowledge translation program manager at Sick Kids, and we teach this a lot. We teach terminology around knowledge translation. And what I tell people is that I don't care what you call it, right? Whether you want to call it knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, knowledge exchange, it's all the same thing. I care about how you do it. I care that you're doing it ethically. I care that you know what you're doing. I care that you have a comprehensive process. And so I just wanted to share that thought. I don't know if it anyway, I just wanted to share this thought that sometimes like we give terms more importance than they really need. The most important thing is to make sure that people understand things conceptually. And that's what impacts my work, right? Like as a knowledge broker, does it matter that I'm able to distinguish the term knowledge mobilization? No, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm a good knowledge broker and that I can build partnerships and I can interact with all sorts of different partners. I just wanted to offer that thought because I'm really passionate about that point.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. All right. Thank you all for sharing there. Oh, let's go back here. How do I erase this? Now, of course,
So on your menu, Jack, you just grab the little eraser button.
all right.
You have to click on them. There we go.
Wonderful. All right, Matthias, I'm going to turn it over to you now for a second to chat a little bit more about putting some of these concepts and these skills into practice. And so I know you've had some experience with reviewing articles and producing these plain language summaries. Can you share a little bit about what your process was when you were actually doing this work?
Yeah, of course. So like, as you mentioned, kind of my experience essentially comes from reviewing a few of the right way summaries and also from when I was in university, having to review articles for either studying or to complete assignments. So often from my experience, like journal articles are often written for those in academia. So I take the perspective of like, well, what if the person reading is not in academia? What if they're not necessarily experts in research? So I tend to kind of think about kind of who the audience is, right? Is it, for example, a group of parents? Is it designed for parents, that article? Or is it for, are they students who are just starting out their educational career? And then I also try and just kind of read the article and try and understand, what the message of that article is. And also kind of involves like trying to summarize it in my own words. And I also tend to, I try and make understand kind of where are the phrases and words that are considered like academic jargon. So a simple example, right? I might be reading an article and I notice that in the article, it says correlation between point A and point B, right? Well, somebody in academia will understand what correlation is, but what if the person reading doesn't necessarily know what correlation means? So I'll switch that word out for something that's more plain language, such as relationship, right? Everyone understands the word relationship, so I'm just going to stop for a second.
Thank you so far, Matthias. I really appreciate that you've started to break down this process of how you actually approach, reading through the article at least once, right? And then starting to understand, okay, what is the core message? Who is my audience? And in the past, you've said to me, You'll imagine a group of students reading or a group of parent partners, for example, which I think are two good imagined audiences for creating plain language summaries. And then your next step is, as you're reading through, just start to note down those instances of jargon and start to think about, okay, how would I actually replace this? If it is indeed important to have in the plain language summary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize with that. I'm in the office and an alarm went off. It stopped. But to summarize, yeah, exactly. I just try and kind of like understand and make note of kind of, where there is kind of academic kind of jargon, for lack of a better term. So like I said, a simple example is replacing the word correlation with the word relationship, because everyone understands that word.
Great, thank you for that, Matthias. And I'm actually just going to add a couple of different further resources around plain language writing into the chat. The first one is an example of plain language publications from Child Bright's KT library, one of which Matthias contributed to, so you can take a look at that in action. Another is an infographic on the power of plain language writing. And then the last one is from the SPORE Evidence Alliance. It's their plain language one-pager, which I just came across yesterday, but is a really useful resource. All right, last but not least, I do want to quickly go through some, what to my mind are kind of more technical language accessibility considerations, but are still really key for, especially when you're communicating online, as so many of us are nowadays. Just go through 3 basic functions for describing images. And so how to write alt text, how to write long description, and how to write captions, and when it is appropriate to use these 3 writing forms. And so this is taken from the Cooper-Hewitt image description guidelines. So alt text means a short visual description that provides a general sense of the content of an image. It's a sentence fragment that indicates the most important content of the image, approximately 15 words, and contains no period at the end unless it is a complete sentence. Next, long description. The definition of long description is also a little bit longer, unsurprisingly. Long description sets out to provide more extensive and detailed visual information. These can be a couple of sentences, multiple paragraphs, and this is the kind of thing you'll want to use to describe a complex image. It comprehensively describes the most important content of the image, augmented by details. I'll give you an example of this in just a second. And then finally, maybe you've heard the word caption before. This is a visible short text that explains the image or illustration and sometimes includes crediting information, so of the photographer or the producer of the image. This appears below or next to the image and is accessible to anyone. And that is the difference between a caption versus an alt text or a long description. So the first 2 formats are, additional information that is not visible when you click onto a website and looking at an image, but it is there available for a screen reader. And so if you have anyone who is blind or visually impaired and they're using a screen reader to access your web page or social media, then they'll be able to still understand what the contents of the image is, and that's really key for accessibility. And so this is, again, from Cooper-Hewitt. I want to show you how they put this into practice. And so I don't know if anyone recognizes this as a portrait of Michelle Obama. Here's an example of alt text to describe this portrait. Portrait of former First Lady Michelle Obama seated looking directly at us. So as you can see, it's very short and sweet. It's not giving you every single detail or description in this portrait. It is the essential information. Now, if I want to use long description to describe the same image, it might be something like this. A portrait painting of former First Lady Obama depicts her medium dark skin rendered in grayscale. She is seated and wears a sleeveless halter top style dress that flows outward beyond her feet, extending past the edges of the painting. There is more to this. I won't read it all, but as you can tell, it's really honing in on different kind of details of the portrait. And this is often important in art history context, for example, or I'm thinking about arts-based therapy and medicine, right? You want to be able to understand the complexity of the image. let's see, this is the continuation of the long description. And then finally the caption, which would appear, let's say if I were putting this image on our website, it would say Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, born 1964, Chicago, Illinois. So you see, this is 3 different ways of describing the same image. In the Child Bright context, this might look something like this. You know, this is the graphic that we used to promote this first session of our workshop. And this is what we actually wrote to describe it in alt text. So it's actually a little bit longer than the alt text guidelines from Cooper Hewitt. There's a good reason for that. So we wrote a top-down view of a notepad and succulent on a green desk. The headshots of Jacqueline DiBartolomeo, Matthias Castaldo, and Megan Callahan appear on the left. Text reads, "What's the story? A patient-oriented communications workshop series. Part 1, How to Make Your Writing More Accessible, February 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern." And the reason why we do have, you know, we've written out here the text that is contained within the graphic is because we will often be using graphics, especially on social media, to promote events or to recruit participants. We want to make sure that if we're including text in the image, that that is also accessible to people using screen readers. And so we will be typing that out in the alt text there. And so this is something to keep in mind if you are creating recruitment posters and you're circulating those online, if you are trying to promote events and you're using graphics with text on them, to make sure that you're using that alt text function, and that is Child Bright usage. All right, it's already 1:52, and I do want to leave a couple of minutes for questions and further discussion from audience members. But before I do that, Matthias and Megan, I just want to hear from the both of you. What are your final thoughts? What's the big takeaway you hope that participants today come away from this workshop with? Megan, maybe I'll start with you, since you're leaning in. You seem very keen.
Sure. Well, I just want to kind of bring it back to this idea of storytelling, and that it is something that is, in a way, it is intuitive to humans and how we communicate and interact. And I will tell a story to conclude. I remember when I was doing my undergrad and I took my first ever creative writing class, and our teacher would often eavesdrop on us in the halls as we talked about like our weekends and what we had done. And he would always say, you know how to tell a story. I hear you guys tell stories all the time, and you know how to connect with your peers, and you know how to tell something that's engaging. And it's really just about, when it comes to writing, it's just about tapping in to those abilities that we all do have, that we have already acquired. So if you think, accessible writing is maybe daunting, I would just say, just remind yourself that this is something you do all the time, and it's just about using it in a different context.
I like that, Megan. Thank you for that reminder. Matthias?
Yeah, I think just kind of reiterating some of the points that we've kind of spoken to. It's just like, the concept that, knowledge is power, right? We want the writing, like our information, to have an impact, right? So the more people can read and understand it, the more they're going to use it. And that's something that's incredibly important to know. It's going to have a massive impact. The greater audience that the writing has. So the more we're able to use language that is accessible, that is respectful of our audience, then the greater impact it's going to have, the more empowerment it's going to be for the audience and as well as the writer.
I appreciate that, Matthias, and the focus on impact and understanding how power also flows through language. I'm inspired by Megan to share the origin of the title of the workshop, which is "What's the Story?" Because this is something that my mom says all the time. And so whenever, she's done so much unpaid labor for me over the years in rereading essays and articles, and me talking to her on the phone about my ideas. And that's always, she'll say, "What's the story? Like, what is it?" And so I feel like, to me, You know, my mom is my default audience, imagined audience. If I want someone to read something that I write and understand it, I think about, would my mom get this? She's a very smart person. She has a master's in mathematics. She doesn't do what I do. So how would I explain it to her in a way that makes sense? So there's that peer review component there, but there's also that audience component there. All right, I will wrap up the official portion of our session now. We have 4 minutes for any questions or comments that you may all have. I see that we already have a question from Sierra in the chat, and that question is, could you narrow down what isn't ableism in the research world? On social media, that term is thrown around quite loosely. Sierra, I don't know if you would be able to expand a little bit on that question, because I'm not exactly sure if I'm understanding it correctly. Would you unmute or explain a little bit more via the chat?
Yeah, it was around the distinction between like disabled and handicapped. Because even some people, like I've seen this on LinkedIn a little bit and then on TikTok a little too, they were even considering like disabled a bad word
Mm.
and like trying to invent new terms to get around that. And I feel like it's like I don't know if people writing that are disabled or not themselves, but I feel like it's them being quite sensitive on our behalf. And then I'm like, I don't need you to like define a different term for me. And also, like I appreciate the practical examples you had because I think people get quite emotional about it instead, or feel like it's not about like set in stone terms and more like a vibe people get. So that's what I see on social media a lot. So how do you tackle those things when it comes to the articles you write? Because it's I feel like so many people are looking for like a reactionary take like that. So
That
how do you navigate that?
That is such a good question, Sierra. And, you know, oftentimes I think in this kind of workshop and, you know, Megan displayed these kind of examples of, you know, commonly used terms and some less ableist alternatives. It makes it seem like, oh, it's very easy to just avoid, you know, all ableist languages. So you're going to be easily able to just make sure you write in a way that makes sense to everyone. And that's actually not the case, right? A lot of the times, you know, meaning is negotiated. You know, communication is obviously shared, and there will inevitably be tension and disagreement. And I think, Sierra, you correctly pointed out that there is a lot of sensitivity around the words that we use. And so the way that we have approached it in the past is, like I've mentioned, we do develop we have a Child Bright style guide that sets out our preferred terminology. So for example, using person first terminology instead of identity first. So we'll say, you know, someone who is living with autism spectrum disorder as opposed to autistic. But we also hear back from some people saying, oh, actually, I do prefer the latter term. And so, you know, we are sensitive to, you know, individual preferences, but also always trying to keep an ear out or an eye out for this kind of discourse, whether it happens online or in community. Just, you know, if there seems to be like a general shift moving away from one term and towards another, then we can pay attention to that. But when it boils down to it, I think there'll never be 100% consensus, and that's not, you know, my expectation either. So not an easy answer there, Sierra, on my end anyway, but I appreciate the question about the thorny nature of evolving language.
Yeah.
All right, it is
I just
already 2
add-
o'clock.
Oh.
So sorry, Megan, it is already 2 o'clock, and I do want to just point out that our next workshop is on February 19th about how to use social media to do public scholarship. You'll be hearing from Sierra Lynn, actually, among other speakers. And so please do sign up and join us again on the 19th.
All right. Well, do want to thank you all for joining us today. Especially thank you to Matthias, Jack, and Megan for facilitating the session. So look forward to connecting again soon. Hopefully you can join us again next week for the follow-up session. We will reach out with recording of this of today's session and some of the resources that were mentioned. So stay tuned for those coming in your inbox. And yeah, we'll also reach out with a feedback survey. So if you have any suggestions to make, we'll be happy to hear your reflections. And so with that, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will hope to see you next week. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.